In today's video, we're going to be talking about why God most likely exists. We're going to first cover some of the arguments for the existence of God, as well as how some of the responses to these arguments are unsatisfactory, and also talk about some of the arguments against the existence of God and show why some of the responses to them actually are very powerful. And thus, by knowing why there's good reasons to believe in God and the reasons to not believe in God aren't as strong, we can come to the conclusion that God most likely exists. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let's get right into it. There are two main arguments that I would recommend people to go to when they're entering into questioning whether God exists or not. This is not to say there are numerous arguments for the existence of God in the history of Christian and in the philosophy of religion. For example, there's the ontological argument, there's the newer arguments like psychophysical harmony and cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, and so forth. Religious experience, for example. However, the two that I would recommend people to go to, partially because they're the most simple, but also because they are the easiest to present and understand, and also they have a lot of extant literature on them, is the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument. Both arguments, although they're simple, do have a lot of strong and robust arguments for them, as well as a lot of different responses to them, which have become quite common in literature, and so it's quite easy to familiarize yourself with that debate. Let's first look into cosmological arguments. There's a few different cosmological arguments. There's the Kalam cosmological argument, which says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, pointing towards a transcendent, powerful creator God of the universe. Now, there's, of course, a contingency argument, which follows a similar line. It follows from the principle of sufficient reason. It says all contingent things cannot be self-explained and need an explanation beyond its own existence or beyond its own nature. Thus, since all things are contingent, there must be a further explanation for its existence. So there are two different forms of this cosmological argument. There's more developments, which you can check in a fascinating book by William Lane Craig, which says Cosmological Arguments from Plato to Leibniz. I think that's the name of the book. But I would say that's probably a more in-depth book if you want to go into the topic. However, those are the two main concepts and the cosmological arguments that have been presented. Now, the arguments for these, or arguments in support of the cosmological argument, is firstly the self-evidence of causation. When I do something like I pick up this hand or wrist strengthener, I do it, I'm actively causing with my brain some actions in the physical world, which is then causing me to have an influence on the physical world. And things act in causation. For example, in science, if you put in chemistry, you mix some sodium into some water, you're causing there to be an interaction. The ways in which the particles interact with each other leads to or causes some fundamental change in reality. There is a clear emphasis and recognition of causation in the world. So that's one of the main reasons for why we believe in it. Everything we do is based on causation. When I go out and take the bus, I believe that by me walking onto the bus, I'm actually causing myself to be on the bus instead of me just disappearing and teleporting somewhere else. We believe in the rational ordering of the universe, which is tied deeply to a form of causation. Now, another reason for this is arguments against infinitude of the past. Now, the idea of an actual infinity is not philosophically or mathematically impossible. I recommend you to check out my interview with Dr. Graham Oppy, one of the prominent actual atheistic philosophers or agnostic philosophers on this topic, where he talks about how mathematical infinities are not impossible, but even this prominent engagement, proponent of agnostic position does recognize that those situations or those presentations of infinity do not translate very well into the real world. And as a result, there's good reason to deny the applicability of actual infinities in the real world because, there's loads of paradoxes about it. For example, Grim Reaper's paradox and Hilbert's Hotel, paradoxes like this. But a good example of this of infinity is to think, if you think about numbers in actual infinities, you know very quickly that, an infinite number plus a finite number is the exact same infinite number. And if you have an infinite number minus a finite number, you also get the exact same number, the infinite number you started to begin with. So if you have Aleph null plus Aleph plus 1, you get Aleph null. If you get Aleph null being the sign for infinity, or at least the first order of infinity, then you have Aleph 1 or Aleph null times 2, you also get Aleph null. So the way in which actual infinities work, although mathematically is robust in the same way that 0 works in mathematics, it's not exactly something which works very well when we apply it to in the real world, because we think about things on a space-time continuum, you're like, well, kind of if I add things to that space-time continuum, by definition, there is more things on the space-time continuum, and thus there is a bit of a contradiction there, or some difficulties which arise if you try to affirm an actual infinite past. Now, if that's the case, then, well, there's good reason to think if causation exists and the past is finite, then there must be a first cause to the universe, which doesn't need a further cause to it. And then if you think about what is the nature of a first cause of the universe, which doesn't need further causes, which is just true by definition, you cannot say, well, oh, what caused that? Well, that's not a good response, because, well, if you say, well, what caused that? We know from our previous two arguments that there is a first cause which is uncaused. So when the atheist says, well, what caused that cause? Actually, you should think the atheist should be asking the question, well, why is that cause uncaused? Because we know already from the previous arguments that there is a first cause. We need to now think about what is the nature of that cause. So that is the strengths of the cosmological argument, but there are some challenges that people have provided. Firstly, people deny causation. David Hume famously denies causation in favor of constant conjunction. So when I do things, it just so happens that causation works together. It is a framework in which we apply to the world. I mean, that's what Kant later develops to say, well, causation is merely a way in which we can structure and understand our experiences. It might not actually be in the world. Hume makes a similar argument to say, well, okay, when I unscrew my blotting paper, that it just so happens that me doing this would lead it to be unscrewed. It does not necessarily mean I cause it. Now, that is one way to look at philosophy. That's one way to look at science, to say everything is not causation, but constant conjunction. But the problem with that, although it does indeed defeat the cosmological argument, I think it commits you to a very non-intuitive understanding of the interactions of the world. And while I'm not going to say, well, if you deny causation, it means anything can happen, that things are floating out of nowhere. What it does mean, however, is to say, the common sense understanding of the world is based on the idea that I am indeed impacting the world. Our understanding of free will, our understanding of engagement with other people, it intuitively relies on a very strong idea of the principle of sufficient reason. And as a result, we can say that I think it's more reasonable to affirm the cosmological argument, at least its causation part, and not affirm the denial of causation. Now, the second argument that has been proposed is to say, well, let's just say this first cause is a brute fact. It just so happened to exist. It's brute. There doesn't need to be any explanation. Now, I can understand why people might say that, but I think it's also, once again, very intuitive, because to say something's a brute contingent fact, this is different from something being a brute necessary fact. If something's just a brute contingent fact, well, then in that situation, why is there only one brute contingent fact which began without a cause? Because by definition, contingent facts have, at least from common experience, have explanations for them. So it would seem to just be a very random coincidence that there is just one contingent fact that doesn't need an explanation, whereas all other contingent facts do need explanations. So, and alternatively, say it's a necessary fact, then you get closer to the theistic position. And in most cases, if you just say the theistic position is a fundamental necessary grounding of reality, then, well, that's would consider to be the success of the cosmological argument to some degrees. Of course, theists develop that further, but nonetheless, the cosmological argument is once again proved correct. So I think it's quite clear to say, well, if you're faced between a brute contingent fact versus saying it's a necessary fact, which is the fundamental grounding of reality, I'll say the necessary fact just makes more sense. It's more reasonable to believe in that instead of saying, well, okay, out of all the contingent facts, only the first cause of the universe is contingent. So those are the two main responses to the cosmological arguments. Now, there are objections to the infinitude of the past, and people say, well, yes, the past is finite, well, infinite. For more information on those discussions, go check out the video with Dr. Graham Oppie, or the discussion that I had with Dr. Andrew Loke, which is on my other channel, Philosophy for All, where we go into depth, with the case of Andrew Loke, into the Kalam cosmological argument. I will link those above, so make sure to go check them out. However, now that we've talked a bit about the cosmological argument, let us turn to the fine-tuning argument, which is equally as interesting and insightful. I wouldn't go too far in depth with it, but essentially the fine-tuning argument starts off with saying the conditions which lead to human life are extremely small. They're really, really small probability, but then human life exists, and we know that human life is significant. So if that's the case, how did this come to be? We could have just been anything else. If the universe had different parameters, the universe would simply just not exist in the same way. It would not only not exist in the same way, the particles in the universe would expand at such great rates that they would not be able to combine and form an orderly universe that we have today. However, we do know that the universe is orderly, and it has indeed not only be orderly, like, I mean, Saturn's orderly, but it can't sustain life. The world is such a good example of how life can be sustained here that we look around and we're like, well, this just seems too much of a coincidence to be true. And Dr. Luke Barnes gives an example, and this is from an interview I had with him on my other channel, Philosophy and Theology, which I'll link above. I have an interview with Dr. Luke Barnes and Dr. Robin Collins, two of the foremost scholars on the fine-tuning argument. But if you looked up in the sky and it quoted John 3:16 or something like, if God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son, so whoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life. That will give you a non-zero, or in fact, a very good reason to believe that Christianity is true. And in the same way, since the universe is so well fine-tuned for life, then there's good reason to think that God exists, or at least there was a creation or some order behind the universe which exists. Now, I think this is a very powerful and robust argument, just from probabilities alone. The probabilities, it's difficult to deny. I think most scientists do agree with the probabilities of how just unlikely or how lucky we were for the universe to be set up, not only in how the world was formed such that we're living on it, but just the initial conditions of the universe, like gravitational forces and cosmological constants and things like that. It's really low probability, which is very impressive. And based on that groundwork, based on that framework, we can say most likely God exists. Now, what are some responses to this? Well, one common response is to say multiverse hypothesis, which says, well, there's just numerous multiverses, and the fact that there's so many of them, one must definitely work, or one universe out of all of them should work in theory. And if that's the case, well, you can say, well, maybe that's right. The only problem with that is we don't have any evidence for a multiverse hypothesis. Number two, if there was a multiverse hypothesis, when you think about how do they interact with each other? Do they just clash into each other when two universes form next to each other? And they are clashed into each other because technically a universe you could define as all that takes up space, and that if there's space, there's a universe there. The space is part of the universe. If you have two universes which are next to each other, by definition, there is no space between them. They would be literally right next to each other. They'll be touching. And if that's the case, shouldn't that just be considered as one universe? Now, furthermore, apart from just saying, well, all right, let's propose a multiverse hypothesis, that basically violates most forms of Occam's razor or reasoning to say, well, we should not need to posit really complex causes or hypothesis in order to explain simple facts. And if the suggestion that God created the universe with order is a more simple fact than multiverse hypothesis, which I think it is the case because you're only posing one entity instead of a million or a trillion different entities, well, that's a more simple explanation. So there's responses to that, and I don't find the multiverse argument very powerful. So as you can see, the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument provide good reasons to believe in the existence of God. This is not to say it's impossible for someone to accept a brute fact in response to the cosmological argument, reject the principle of sufficient reason, or suggest that a multiverse hypothesis exists. People can make those arguments, but from my perspective, having read the literature on this, it just seems to me to be the arguments for these two arguments are just way more powerful than the arguments against these two arguments. Now, those are the arguments for God. I think we have good reason to believe God exists. But someone could say, well, all right, it's all good if you have some reason to believe God exists, but at the same time, there's some arguments against God. And the most prominent of these being the problem of evil, the question of, well, if God exists and God is good and he's powerful, why doesn't he remove evil? Now, some people respond to this by saying, okay, let's accept some form of process theology or some form of open theism or some form of a limited theism. All of these suggest some limits to God's power, either by knowledge, via power, via his control over the world. They provide some limits to God's power, which would make him not responsible or being unable to prevent evil from happening. And I would not touch those responses, while I think there are possible solutions under which, even if the problem of evil does defeat the classical God of Christian monotheism or Arabic monotheism, but even if the problem of evil defeats the God of monotheism, it doesn't mean God doesn't exist. So that's a preface I'd like to make. Nonetheless, I would argue that there's good responses to each of the problem of evil. I mean, the problem of evil, there's loads of literature on this. However, I would just, in this video, just respond to the logical and evidential problem of evil, which are the two main problems of evil. There's an abductive problem of evil, which falls under the evidential problem of evil, which I'm not going to touch. So firstly, logical problem of evil is the idea that God and evil are logically inconsistent, such that if a God can remove any evil that exists and knows about every evil that exists, then he would remove all evil that exists. Now, that's a logical problem of evil presented by J.L. Mackie, really wonderful writer in an article called Evil and Omnipotence. But in response to that, most scholars have accepted that the free will defense defeats this argument. And how does it defeat it? It says, well, free will. It is plausible. It doesn't need to be actually the case, but it is plausible for God to believe that there's a higher order good like free will, which would allow for humans to do evil in that circumstance. So in this world in which free will is a higher order good, this is not necessarily this world, but there is one possible world in which freedom is a higher order good, and thus God gives humans freedom, and they use their freedom to do good or evil. And as a result, from this free will defense, he can show that there's one possible world in which God, evil, exists, which means the logical problem of evil as a deductive argument fails. However, there's the evidential problem of evil, which is a bit stronger. It says, well, all right, yes, it could be the case that God and evil exist, but it's just very unlikely. God will most likely remove evil, which exists. Now, in this situation, there's two evils that need addressing. There's moral evil and natural suffering, which are technically suffering and not evil, unless you believe that all suffering in the world is caused by demons and devils, which is a plausible way, which will make all suffering free will or, well, evil as well. But let's separate the natural suffering from the moral evil, because there's good responses to both of them. In response to moral evil, free will is once again a very strong response given by people like Richard Swinburne and, of course, Alvin Plantinga, who say, well, these figures write that having a world with free will is intrinsically more valuable than a world without free will, in the sense that God creates us not just to exist in the world, but to come and love and serve him and glorify him. And these actions of love, glorification, doing a good deed, by doing good in the world, loving each other, all require free will, and thus the very purpose, the telos of human creation requires free will, and thus the free will defense stands, because in order to have free will, one must have moral responsibilities to do both good, but also have the capacity to do evil, because if you're only free to be able to do good, well, that's not morally sufficient freedom for you to actually make your moral decisions valuable. Because if I gave my kid, and this is something very interesting by Jordan Peterson, he says, well, okay, you say you would never cheat on your wife, fine, but do you even have the opportunity to cheat on a wife if you did? Because if some guy says, well, I'm such a faithful guy, I'm never going to cheat on my wife, but even if he wanted to cheat on his wife, he couldn't, well, that just suggests, well, not only that he might not be really faithful, he just doesn't have the opportunity to do it, but also doesn't really show that, oh, your loyalty is very good. It doesn't mean he's not loyal, but also means that, well, his loyalty hasn't been tested, and he doesn't even have the opportunity to be disloyal. So, well, that's not necessarily something to be extremely proud of. Now, that's one response to the problem of moral evil. But now when you turn to natural suffering, a good response to that is to rely on the fine-tuning argument, to say, well, all right, the causes required for human existence is really, really fine-tuned. The universe is set up in such a finely tuned way that if the universe was set up any differently by even such a small infinitesimal change to the universe, either its gravitational constants, the way atoms interact with each other, how energy gets transferred, if any of these change, well, the problem is humans just simply would not exist. And while it is callous to say, well, all animal evil, and animal evil is something that a lot of people touch on, animal suffering, Alex O'Connor likes it quite a lot, but you could say, well, all animal suffering, all of these things, yes, really horrible stuff. But if it was any different, the universe simply just would not have existed, and humans simply would not have existed. So as much as we like to say, well, natural suffering is a very big problem, and it is, we could not have had it any other way, because if we did have it any other way, humans simply wouldn't exist. And if it's a choice between humans existing or humans not existing, the theist, under a theist framework, can say, because since the problem of evil is a challenge for internal consistency, the theist can say, well, simply God wants humans to exist, and this is the only way he could have done it, based on natural laws and a physical world. And who knows if he did it any other way, whether it would be way worse. I don't think we have much evidence to think it could be way better, because, as I've said, if the universe changed in a very small way, nothing is going to work scientifically. And the final question that people might have is to say, well, why doesn't God intervene more? Why can't, well, okay, it's all nice and good that God requires this form of evolutionary process such that we exist, but why can't God just have made it such that if a fawn is dying in a forest, he could just intervene and stop that? Or if someone's drowning in the sea, he could just intervene and stop that. Well, that sounds all right until you think about actually what would happen. God would be intervening so much in the world, not only to save people, but also to prevent people from engaging or falling into natural suffering. But what would God have to do? If you were swimming in the sea and you suddenly started to drown, is God meant to just remove all the water in the sea on that specific instance? Or if you might have a risk of slipping and falling down the stairs because of gravity, is he meant to suspend gravity for that second? In all these situations, the question arises, well, would we still be able to carry out scientific process in a world in which God is intervening all the time to prevent natural suffering? Or when I am about to kill the mosquitoes, the mosquito meant to teleport out outdoors and just no longer get killed by me. All these things, you'll be like, well, is it even possible to create a universe on those standards? Is it even possible to create scientific inquiry on those standards? Perhaps not, because then since science is formed by induction, which is an ultimately uniform experience of the world, well, that would simply we would not have any uniform experience of the world. And that's the problem of evil, which is the strongest argument against the existence of God, at least in my approximation, simply does not stand. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, whether you agree or disagree with anything I've said. Once again, share it with your friends and family. This is your resident Oxford Philosophy and Theology student here. Hope you enjoyed this video. Stay safe. See you soon, and I'll see you in the next one.